Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I am your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with episode number 54 of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael Skovac. Tonight we'll be covering Acts chapter 1. 21, that is. Acts chapter 1 plus 20. It's always got to have something there. Just a little tiny hiccup, because otherwise people would think we weren't real, Rabbi. You know what I'm saying?
That's true. You can't be too perfect.
Oh, my. Wow. It's good to see you again. Glad to have you back almost in the studio. Try to get
Great to be here.
Yes, it is great for me to be here with you as well. And I'm sure everybody else feels the same. So welcome back. And thank you for all the viewers who tune in each week. And we really appreciate y'all's support. So, well, Rabbi, it's been a good time of wait. So we'll wait no longer. Tell us what you got for this week.
This is a action-packed chapter.
Wonderful. That's what we like.
This is really... this is probably one of the more important chapters in the book of Acts. And, Paul has been traveling around Asia Minor and, basically hanging around all these lands outside the land of Israel. But we saw that last week in chapter 20, Luke wrote in chapter 20, verse 22, quoting Paul, I think he's quoting Paul here, that Paul felt bound by the Spirit. He says, "And now behold, I am bound by the Spirit. I am on my way to Jerusalem, not knowing what will happen to me there." I pointed out last time on the program that he seemed to have had some premonitions that when he gets to Jerusalem, it's going to be a little bit hairy. But he said in chapter 20 that, he's going there by the directive of the Holy Spirit. And in chapter 21, we see that they're sailing his ship with his entourage. They're coming, you see they're getting closer because they pass Cyprus. It says in verse 3, they sighted the island of Cyprus, and we passed it on the left. This sounds like we're getting, someone driving in their car letting us know what's going on. And then it says they sailed to Syria after they passed Cyprus. Now, it says that they landed at Tyre. Now, I think that back then they referred to that area as Syria. I think in modern times, Tyre would be located in what we'd call modern-day Lebanon. As a matter of fact, back, I think it was, I'm not sure what year it was now, maybe 1996, if I'm not mistaken, the Second War. There was a war in Lebanon that Israel fought in 1982, and I think the second one, at least to my memory, was in 96. And there was a lot of action around these two cities of Tyre and Sidon, which are in north of Israel. Here they refer to it as Syria, but I think that today we'd call it Lebanon. And so they landed there at Tyre, and we're told, interestingly, in verse 4, that the disciples told Paul through the Spirit not to go up to Jerusalem. Now, this is not a question I'm going to deal with, but many of the Christian commentaries are bothered because Paul heard from the Spirit. Paul was directed by the Spirit just a few verses earlier to go to Jerusalem. Now the Spirit sent the disciples not to go to Jerusalem. So this presents a little bit of a problem with the Spirit. What is the guidance of the Holy Spirit here? There doesn't seem to be a clear picture. So this is the kind of question that's discussion just pass it by. I just wanted to point it out.
Okay.
And so we're told that after they finished, in verse 7, they finished their stay, I guess, in Tyre. They stayed for one day. The next day, they departed and came to Caesarea. Caesarea. I can never pronounce the name of this city. I've been there. Caesarea. and it's one of the most amazing cities in Israel now. You have all these incredible ruins there. And they entered the house of Philip the evangelist. And he was one of the seven. Apparently, there were people I forget which chapter it was, earlier on, I think possibly in chapter 6 or 7, I don't remember the exact chapter, where there were a number of people who were appointed as special disciples. And he was one of the 7 that were appointed. And we're told in verse, these numbers are getting smaller and smaller on me, that Philip had 4 virgin daughters who prophesied. And so they were able to, deliver prophecy to the other disciples. And then we're told in verse 10 that they stayed many days there, and there was a prophet named Agabus. I don't know how to pronounce his name either. I hope all these people that are long dead will forgive me for mispronouncing their names.
That's funny.
But they named this other prophet, aside from the 4 virgin daughters of Philip, who was also identified as a prophet. We know, because we met him before in chapter 11 of Acts, where he had prophesied that there'd be a famine throughout the entire world. That seems like a pretty bold prediction to make. I think it's a bit of an exaggeration. I did see that the claim is made in at least some Christian commentaries that there were famines, in different parts of the world at different times. So the way they really read this is not that there would be at one time a famine that hit the entire world, but there'd be, I guess, these minor famines that would sort of move around that part of the world. In any event, this prophet named Agabus, he also gives a similar prophecy about Paul going to Jerusalem. He says that he understands from the Holy Spirit that the Jews of Jerusalem will bind the man who owns this belt and deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles. He basically is saying to Paul that, look, if you go to Jerusalem, just, you'll be in for some bad weather. And I just wanted to mention, we've spoken about this before, that according to Jewish teaching, according to what Jewish teachings relate, this is impossible to understand literally, these stories about Philip's 4 daughters who prophesied and Agabus, who was a prophet, because prophecy ended about 400 years before this. There were no more prophets. And the Jewish sages speak about why prophecy ended, around the time that the first temple was destroyed, approximately, a little bit after that. And, a few things had taken place. Not only where prophecy came to an end, but you didn't have any further. There was sort of an ending of supernatural miracles that took place. And many of the things that would happen in the holy temples stopped taking place. And one of the reasons was that there was a diminishing of the powers, the negative forces, and the negative forces of sorcery and witchcraft were also coming to an end. And so because in the book of Ecclesiastes we learn that God created a world where things are in a spiritual balance. And so when negative spiritual forces are diminished, there's going to be a diminishing of positive spiritual forces as well, because there has to be a balance. You can't have more of a lure towards, let's say, idolatry than the opposite forces in the world. So we don't have any more prophets. And as far as Judaism is concerned, there were no prophets at this time. We know that the Torah tells us that prophecy will be restored in the Messianic age. And so it's possible that since, according to Christians, they were living in the Messianic age, they believed that with the advent of Jesus, the Messianic age was upon them. So it's not so absurd for them to believe that they had prophets, meaning that if there is a tradition, the prophecy will be resumed. in the Messianic times, and these are followers of Jesus who believe he was the Messiah and they had entered into the Messianic age, then they believed that they could have prophets. Of course, from a Tanakh Jewish point of view, this was very obviously not the Messianic age. Nothing had happened. None of the prophecies about the Messiah or the Messianic age had been fulfilled. Literally nothing positive had taken place, since Jesus came and left the earth. But the point of view of obviously the evangelists here and the gospel writers and the book of Acts is that they did have a restoration of prophecy because from their point of view, they were living in the Messianic times. It could be, another way of looking at it is that Luke here and the rest of the time, every other time we see a mention of prophets and prophecy, is they're not using the word in a technical term. Meaning that it could be they're using the term loosely as just a designation of people who had a special office in the movement. People spoke about Steve Jobs from Apple Computers as a prophet, as a modern prophet. So it's obviously the term is not being used in a technical sense of someone who had the qualities of a prophet, because we know that in the Torah, you don't become a prophet simply because you claim to be a prophet. There had to be the validation of prophecy through the leading Jewish sages, the Sanhedrin at the time, and obviously Philip's 4 virgin daughters were never decreed as legitimate prophets by the Jewish sages, and obviously this Agabus wasn't as well. So what happens is, again, they repeat this dire warning to Paul that showing up in Jerusalem is going to be, he'll be in for a rough ride. So in verse 17, Paul, because he felt he had to go to Jerusalem, he shows up in Jerusalem and he says the brethren received us there. So it was not just Paul, but Paul with his delegation. And in verse 18, on the following day, Paul went up. Here Luke obviously is writing. Again, it's interesting, we pointed out last week that Luke sort of flits in and out of the book of Acts, and he is usually writing about things as an observer, but not a participant. He's just writing the narrative. In certain chapters of Acts, he's actually on the scene. So last week in chapter 20, Luke popped into the narrative and he reports as one of the people in the story. Here as well, he says that Paul went in with us to James. So Luke is there writing as one of the group. And all the elders of the movement, the Jerusalem group, were present. And here it becomes, this is the more significant part of the chapter. So when he greeted him, this seems to be saying that when James greeted Paul, Paul, told in detail those things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. Now, before I get into the report of Paul, I just wanted to point out that we have to, again, bear in mind who James is. James, as we know, is one of the brothers of Jesus, and he had become the leader of the Jesus movement as soon as he really became a follower, and he was really the leader for about 30 years until after the crucifixion. We know that although there's almost no real historical corroboration that Jesus ever existed, meaning that we don't really have virtually any information or corroboration of Jesus's existence outside the Gospels, we do know that James was a historical figure. We know that he's written about, for example, in Josephus. So we have evidence of James. As a matter of fact, a few years ago, you remember that they found the ossuary of James. This is the bone box.
Right.
Right. People back then were, when they died, they were interred usually in some kind of a vault, a cave, and their body was laid in a bone box until the flesh, really faded away, and then the bones were buried permanently in a bone box called an ossuary. And so they found this ossuary of James, and on the side it said James, I think it said the brother of Jesus, the son of Joseph. So we have, it's interesting, I mean, you don't have, at least at this point, you don't have a similar find for Jesus, although if you look at some of the work that's being done by Simcha Yakubovich in Jerusalem, he's pretty close to having that kind of documentation about where Jesus actually, he believes, is buried. But we have actual, really clear, legitimate historical and archaeological corroboration that James existed. He was called James the Just or James the Righteous because he was, we know, an observant Jew. We have a letter that he wrote called the Epistle or the Letter of James. And it's interesting that Martin Luther was very unhappy. He was not a big fan of the Epistle of James. He said if it was up to him, he would have it eliminated from the New Testament because it didn't really speak about Jesus in the way the church had come to understand who Jesus was over the past 2,000 years.
In fact, it was quite the contrary, wasn't it?
Yeah, it really seemed to be of a different order altogether. It didn't speak about, for example, justification by faith. It speaks on the contrary, the need to have works, that the letter of James specifically says that we're justified by works, not only by our faith. So for someone like Martin Luther, that was not good stuff. And the great irony was that when you think about it, if you wanted to have any historical figure that would be an incredibly important person to know in order to have a clearer vision of who Jesus was, it would have been James. Again, he's the brother. He led the movement for 30 years. Jesus only led the movement for 3 years. So James is the brother of Jesus. He was with him. He knew Jesus. He led the movement for 30 years. And we know that he was someone who was Torah observant. We have one of his letters. And yet the incredible irony was throughout history, James has been totally obscured, meaning that over 2,000 years, there's almost no Christian art or iconography or writing about James at all. I mean, he seems to have been totally eclipsed and forgotten about. And it wasn't really until the last 20, 30 years that scholars have become fascinated with this person named James. So we see here that, when Paul shows up in Jerusalem, he makes a beeline for James. And what Paul says to James is that you see, brother, how many myriads of Jews, that's the translation I'm working with, how many myriads of Jews there are who believed, meaning that they believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And they are all zealous for the law, meaning that these are people that are extremely Torah observant. The literal meaning of this word that's translated here as myriads, the literal meaning in the Greek is tens of thousands. And I think it's a huge exaggeration. It's interesting that David Stern, in his commentary, suggests that there were at least 400,000 Messianic Jews prior to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70. And he says that possibly up to 1 million. Now, I think anyone that has any sense as to what life in Israel was like back then, it is totally impossible to imagine that there were that many Jewish followers of Jesus.
It's just like the elections this year is a perfect example. It seems like every news station there was saying, they were saying, Trump's falling behind. Hillary's just like smoking him like a Cuban cigar. But then when you look at the actual map, it's like the entire U.S. was like 85% red. And then they, even on the very tail end, they came back and apologized. Well, I guess we were kind of wrong. We need to get our facts a little bit more straight. I'm thinking, really? But that's an effective tool, though, is to lie to people and to tell them I mean, I'm going to tell you something. When I was in the Christian faith myself, me and a friend of mine who was in the ministry together, we used to make up lies just to get people to think our story was that much more dynamic, you know. And it wasn't just us. A lot of people I knew did this, and if a lot of people that I personally knew did this, I mean, think about that. That's just really
Well, yeah, I I'm not clear really um, if this is there a problem with the sound, William? I'm getting a lot of feedback.
Are you? Let me check the. I hear you fine.
Oh, so
I
I'm
don't
hearing
hear anything, my
myself.
man. Is there a possibility that something's coming through your room speaker? Maybe pull your headphone off on one side and see if you can hear yourself inside your room there.
No, there's nothing coming out, but
Interesting.
I was hearing reverberation. It was I was
Oh,
hearing everything twice.
like a vibration, sort of.
No, I was hearing myself speak, and then about a second later, the same words repeated. But
Oh,
now it's gone.
oh, interesting.
I think
Interesting.
the LSD is worn off. Okay, Baruch Hashem.
Okay, good deal.
So, so
Woo.
it's not clear. Oh, there it comes again.
Oh wow! I wonder if anybody else can hear. Can anybody out there in Tanakh Talk Land actually hear any sound? I don't think that's happening out there. I think it's just coming through on your end. I don't know what I could do on my end to turn that to
Oh,
keep that from
okay.
happening though. But
It's just very it's disconcerting because I can't really speak clearly. Um, the problem is that if we have to go with this translation of tens of thousands, it is impossible to believe that in Jerusalem at that time there were tens of thousands of Torah observant Jews that were following Jesus as the Messiah. To say that there were a whole bunch, couple of thousand maybe, and to go with David Stern's estimates of between 400,000 and a million, just totally, it's science fiction as far as I'm concerned. But look, I'm just a humble rabbi. Who am I to disagree with these great minds? Anyway, whatever it is, it's not impossible for me to imagine that there were a few hundred, maybe 1,000 or two, maybe even a little bit more than that, Jews who really did believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and they were Torah observant. So that's the report that Paul, I'm sorry, that James reflects back to Paul. Again, so what happened is Paul had reported the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry, and then it says when they heard it, they meaning the James and his group, they glorified the Lord. They were very happy about what Paul was doing outside of Israel. And then they said to Paul, you see, brother, how many myriads of Jews there are who believe, meaning they believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and they are all zealous for the law. They are all very, very Torah observant. But then the crucial phrase comes in verse 21. But they, meaning that these Torah observant Jews who follow Jesus as the Messiah, they've been informed about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, which means obviously Moses is long dead, but to forsake following the laws of Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. That's a pretty heavy report. And so it's important, let's just get ourselves straight here. It's important to understand that the followers of Jesus, which means that they just believed he was the Messiah, and they believed he would return soon to bring about the Messianic age. That's what it meant that these people were followers of Jesus. They were probably not much different than other Jews living in Israel at the time. They just had this unusual belief that some person who had died would come back and fulfill the Messianic program. But we know, I believe, and this is the approach I took when we were doing the book of Matthew, that Jesus himself never taught that the Torah should be abolished. We saw numerous places where that's very clear, imminently clear. And we saw that even in the book of Acts, after the death of Jesus, the followers were still Torah observant. We saw that pretty clearly, as far as I'm concerned, in the 5th chapter of Acts, where, in the story at least, the head of the Sanhedrin, Gamliel, seems to have no problem with Peter and James and John. He doesn't seem to be bothered by anything about these people. He says, look, we'll have to see if this movement makes any sense. It'll pass the test of time. But if the apostles and the disciples of Jesus at that point were not observing the Sabbath, they were not keeping kosher, they were praying to Jesus as God. If the disciples at that point were living like Southern Baptists, Gamliel would not have been so conciliatory to them. And we know that this movement of Torah observant people who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, not God, but they believed he was the Messiah, it persisted into the 2nd century with the Ebionites, some say the Nazarenes, who did not think that Jesus was God. They did not believe he was born to a virgin. They did not believe that the Torah was abolished. And then we know that it's not long after the 2nd century, and sometime after, in the middle of the 3rd century, we don't know exactly when the movement literally died. Now, this accusation that James is relaying to Paul, that people are suspicious of him, that he's not Torah observant, he's teaching Jewish people they don't need to keep the Torah or circumcise their children. This was a persistent suspicion about Paul throughout the New Testament. We'll see it coming up over and over again. And we know that it was the major teaching of the Ebionites, these Torah-observant Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah in the 2nd century. They believed that Paul was an apostate because he was not Torah observant. So this is a very, very serious charge that comes up here. And we'll see in a minute that James did not just dismiss it. James didn't say, it's absurd, ridiculous that Paul, you would be teaching such things. You see in the story here that James takes this charge very, very seriously. And he says in verse 22, what are we going to do? What are we going to do with you, Paul? So in verse 23, he says, we have a plan. James says the following, therefore, do what we tell you. He's saying to Paul, look, we're going to have you demonstrate your fidelity to the Torah. We want you to make a demonstration that you are one of us, that you are, on the team, that you are still Torah observant. And so they say, and we'll have to understand what this is all about. He says the following in verse 23. We have 4 men who have taken a vow. So he says, take them and be purified with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads and that all may know that those things of which they were informed concerning you are nothing, but that you yourself also walk orderly and keep the Torah. Okay, so we have to unpack those 2 verses 23 and 24. So here's the plan of James, and I guess James must have cooked this up with his other apostles and disciples. He says, look, Paul, there are 4 men who have taken a vow. Now, what is this vow that they're referring to? So it's very clear that it's referring to a Nazirite vow. Call it in Hebrew, Nazirut. It's interesting that back in chapter 18, most people believe that Paul himself had taken a Nazirite vow back then in chapter 18. But now James is saying that there were 4 people who have taken a Nazirite vow. And the reason that first of all, Nazir, it's called a Nazir, and the Nazirite vow usually was a period of time. Typically, the standard vow was for 30 days. People could do it for longer periods of time. And during that period of time, they could not consume any wine or any grape products, even raisins. They had to stay away completely from any wine or grape products. They couldn't cut their hair, and they couldn't have any contact with someone that was dead, any kind of contact with a corpse. That was the requirements of the Nazir, the Nazirite. And it's very clear that that's what's going on here, because first of all, it speaks about taking a vow. Now, if you go to chapter 6 in Numbers, verse 2, it introduces the laws of the Nazir by speaking about taking a vow. And you don't really have that with any other ritual, really, in the Torah. It's a specific idea of the Nazirite who takes this vow. Also, we see here that they have to shave their heads at the end of the vow. So it's very clear that these are people that didn't shave during this period of time, and they're going to have to shave. And we see in Numbers chapter 6, verse 9, that was part of the procedure when the Nazir ended their apprenticeship, so to speak. They ended their period of time of the vow of being a Nazirite. And then they had to bring special offerings, which we will see in verse 26 in Acts in a few minutes. That's what Paul ends up doing, is helping these people, sponsoring, really, paying the expenses of their offerings. And in Numbers chapter 6, verse 10, we see that the Nazir had to bring special offerings when they finished their period of time of being a Nazir. So that's what's going on here. And the idea that James has is that they're going to make Paul participate in this ritual, and that will demonstrate his fidelity, his loyalty to keeping the Torah. Question that comes up here, and this is the question I first heard from my good friend Rabbi Yisrael Chaim Blumenthal, who used to go around to some of the Bible colleges in Philadelphia and asking this of the experts in the book of Acts. And he would ask, why is it that they chose this test of loyalty? Meaning that they could have had Paul do any number of things to prove that he was still part of the team. For example, they could have had him bring a Korban Toda, a thanksgiving offering. You know, that was typically offered when someone had gone through something that undertook a dangerous experience in life, such as traveling on a ship. Back then, traveling on ships was not so safe, and a person that had taken a journey by a boat would generally offer a special Thanksgiving offering. They could have had him do that. Why did they have to have Paul participate in someone else's rituals? Why didn't they just have Paul say, look, Paul, you just came to Israel on this journey on the seas, bring a Thanksgiving offering. Or they could have had him put on phylacteries, you know, that the Torah speaks about binding a sign upon your arm and frontlets between your eyes. They could have said, Paul, why don't you do that? That's something that the Torah requires. Or they could have had him, let's say, sponsor the expenses of a circumcision. If they were hearing these rumors that Paul was against circumcision, they could have said, look, that we have, 25 babies they're going to be circumcised today in Jerusalem. Why don't you pay for, all of the costs that will be involved in the circumcision? They could have picked so many things for Paul to do. The question is, why have him sponsor the sacrifices of these 4 Nazirites? Why that? And what Rabbi Blumenthal suggests, and this is speculative, but to me it's fascinating, is that Paul had developed his own theology, really. Paul didn't really know much about Jesus. When we go through all the letters of Paul, all the writings of Paul virtually never quotes anything about the life of Jesus. He doesn't really ever quote anything that Jesus ever said. Basically, what Paul is teaching is his own theology, and it comes through in his important letters like the book of Romans, the book of Galatians, etc. And this is what Paul believes is his understanding of the significance of Jesus and who Jesus was. And one of the things that Paul develops at great length in many of his writings is the idea that Jesus died as a sacrifice to atone for the sins of the world, and that his death really replaced the sacrificial system. That once God sent Jesus to be the final, ultimate sacrifice, there are no other sacrifices that are necessary. And Rabbi Blumenthal suggests that possibly the people in Jerusalem had no such concept like this, because we see that they were still going to the temple throughout the book of Acts. The followers of Jesus who were living in Jerusalem, they don't stop going to the temple. They continue going to the temple. They continue participating in the temple rituals. And it's quite possible, and I would say likely, that they had no theology that Jesus' death was a substitutionary sacrifice to atone for the sins of those who would believe in him. That was something that they heard that Paul was teaching, and it could be that this is the reason they wanted Paul to sponsor the sacrifices of the Nazarites, because if you go to the book of Numbers chapter 6, you'll see that the Nazir has to bring several sacrifices at the end of their period of Nazirut, but one of them is a sin offering. One of the sacrifices that the Nazirite has to offer is a sin offering. And they wanted to put Paul in a position where he would have to participate in the bringing of sin sacrifices, as if to say, look, Paul, we hear that you're teaching this weird idea that no, there's no more sin offerings in the temple. Jesus is the once and for all final sin offering. And so that's why they chose this particular test, because the Thanksgiving offering that they could have asked him to bring on his own behalf, it's not a sin offering. It's not a sin sacrifice. It's simply a Thanksgiving offering. So this is speculative, but it at least is an approach to answering the question, which, by the way, you will not see in any Christian commentaries to the New Testament. This is never asked, the question of why James and the disciples in Jerusalem chose this particular test for Paul. Why this particular test? And I think that Rabbi Blumenthal's theory may have some substance to it. Now, when you continue here, after he says that this is the test that you're going to get, Paul, James sort of sums up, though. He says in verse 25, but, however, concerning the Gentiles who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, we have written previously, that was back in chapter 15, and we decided that they should observe no such thing, meaning that they do not have to follow the Torah. They're not under the law, so to speak. They're not under the requirement of following the Torah, which is only incumbent upon Jews. And so James here reiterates that we decided that all they have to do is keep themselves from things that were offered to idols, from blood, from things that were strangled, and from sexual immorality. And that's basically it. And as I suggested back when we studied chapter 15 of Acts, these are basically 4 of the 7 Noahide laws.
Right.
And I believe that what he's basically saying here is it's sort of shorthand for the fact that non-Jews only are obligated to observe what they were always obligated to observe, which are the 7 Noahide laws.
What's really interesting too about this is where the Messianics will still choose to suggest that Paul, and actually it does look like here that Paul and James are kind of directing differently, because that gives him, whenever people would say, well, Acts 21 says we don't have to, blah, blah, blah. And, of course, the number one response to Messianic says, well, Paul didn't say that. Somebody else did. I'm like, but it's in your New Testament. If the New Testament says, I mean, are you a Paulian, or are you a New Testament man? Are you a Christian? What are you? I mean, you kind of have to choose,
Well, I think that's one of the themes that I think we're going to see as we go through the rest of the New Testament, is that there is a clear conflict between Paul and the followers of Jesus, which sometimes is called the Jerusalem Church. And, I think that there are many scholars who say that the book of Acts was written to sort of minimize the conflict between these two groups.
Mm.
And, so they have Paul here going along with, this test, to show that, yes, I'm really one of you guys, don't worry. I'll be speaking about that in a minute. So just let's go one verse further, that in verse 26, and I'm going to have some problems with this verse, as I'll explain, but here's what happens. Then Paul took the men, he took these 4 men, and the next day, having been purified with them, entered the temple to announce the expiration of the days of purification, at which time an offering should be made for each one of them. Now, this is a little bit strange because
offerings were done, right? There was no offerings after Jesus, from what I heard.
Well, that's another issue, but
right.
And just in terms of the ritual of the Nazir, normally there was no period of purification. The idea of being purified was only if they had contact with a corpse. And if they had contact with a corpse, there was a 7-day period of purification. It was something that took place after 3 days, and then there was a final purification after the 7th day. The viewers can see this. I'm not going to get into it in detail.
Sure.
It's described in the book of Numbers, chapter 19. It describes this whole... if you go to verses 11 to 12, it describes the purification of people that had come in contact with someone who was dead. So the only way really of reading this at this point is that this must have been a case where these 4 people had all come in contact with a corpse or corpses, and they had to go through a period of purification. Because, again, normally, the Nazir had to avoid contact with the dead, and the need for a purification period was only if, in an unusual situation, they came in contact with a dead person. And so it sort of stretches the imagination. Was this a case where all 4 of these guys, they all happened to be in contact with dead bodies, which would require, it's possible.
Yeah.
But the problem that I would have then is, why does Paul himself, because it speaks about being purified with them in verse 26, right? Then Paul took the men, and the next day having been purified with them. So he wasn't a Nazir, he wasn't a Nazirite at this point. And so, again, you'd have to say, if this is to make any sense, is that somehow not only did these 4 Nazirites have contact with a corpse, but Paul himself must have been in contact with a corpse, and he had to go through a purification period as well. So just to sum up here, this is the test that James and the disciples want Paul to go through, and he does. And I would ask the question, is it possible that Paul would go along with this test just to get out of this awkward situation? But he's not really being upfront, meaning he's being disingenuous, and he's really faking them out, meaning he's basically, as far as he's concerned, Paul is saying, you know what, I'll do what it takes to please these people. And if they want me to, do this silly thing in the temple and sponsor the sacrifices, this must have been a situation where these 4 Nazirites were poor and they probably couldn't afford their own sacrifices, or maybe James wanted him to pay for the sacrifices anyway, even if they could afford their own sacrifices. But from Paul's point of view, he's in an awkward situation because he's got the whole Jerusalem church at this point, suspicious of him, and he might get disciplined or censured or kicked out of the movement. And so they're saying, look, we want you to sponsor these 4 Nazirites. And Paul says to himself, fine, I'll do whatever it takes to get out of this situation. I'll make them happy. And I think that one of the things we find about Paul, and I don't have the ability tonight to go through these sources carefully. We'll be doing this when we get to these other books. But I think there are at least some indications that Paul had this as part of his modus operandi, that the ends justify the means, and I'll do what it takes. So I'll just give 3 examples. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, there's a famous passage where Paul says, "Look, unto the Jews I become as a Jew so I might win the Jews. To those who are under the law, I become as one who is under the law," even though he says, "I myself am not under the law." So he says that I don't believe I am under the law. I don't believe I'm required to keep the Torah, but in order to win those who are under the law, I'll put on a show. I'll also live like someone who's under the law. And that's in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 20. And we see in verse 22 where Paul says, "I become all things to all people, so by this tactic I might win some." So you see, he has this philosophy of, look, I will do what it takes to achieve my agenda. In Philippians chapter 1, verse 18, Paul says, "Whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, I shall rejoice. Yea, I shall rejoice." So he's saying whether in pretense, meaning whether there is some falsehood going on, or whether it's in truth, as long as the message of the gospel is being preached, he's very happy. And then a passage which I will have to understand, fully what it means when we get to 2 Corinthians.
What do you suppose he meant in verse 21 of 1 Corinthians 9:19? Now, I was always taught that anything that was in parentheses, let me put this up, anything that was written in parentheses or italicized was possibly added later. And this is in parentheses. It says, "To them he became, to those that are without law, as without law." But it says, "being not without law to God." So as a messianic, we would say, well, that right there shows you he kept the law even inwardly. He never walked away from it, but he just floated around. But what do you suppose he meant by that?
Are you saying that phrase is in parentheses?
It's in parentheses, yes.
Yeah, but the previous phrase where he says
is
that
not, right.
To those under the law I become as one under the law, although I myself am not under the law, is not in parentheses.
Correct.
So there is no question that he says that.
Right. Good point.
I think that it's possible that when he says, if he did say to those not under the law, I become as one not under the law, even though I myself am under the law, he could be referring back to the previous verse where he puts himself under the law. I'm not quick. I could never really enter into Paul's mind what he means, but you just get the impression from the entire passage there in 1 Corinthians that he has a philosophy which says, you know what, I will play the part I need to play.
Right.
And he repeats that in Philippians chapter 1, and in 2 Corinthians, that's not first, but 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 16, Paul says, "Crafty fellow that I am, I took you in by deceit." So, again, I don't want to go through all 3 of these passages. It'll require a lot of analysis when we get to them.
What verse? There it is right there, verse 16. Wow.
So, again, it's not the time for us to analyze 2 Corinthians tonight, but I'm just throwing these passages out as a suggestion that it seems to me... I've
never seen that one before. That's amazing.
Right. It seems to me that when Paul goes through this sponsoring of the Nazarites, it doesn't necessarily mean that he is on board with the Torah. He's making a demonstration. He is, putting on a show, so to speak, in order to get these people off his back. And I believe that that's what happened. Now, what takes place after this, it gets really, really hairy. And it's not really clear what happens here. In verse 27, it says, "When the 7 days were almost ended." Now, it seems to imply here that they never had a chance to go through the purification process and then offer these sacrifices. So it seems like Paul agreed to do everything, and it seems that it's all going to get interrupted now, because it says in verse 27, "When these 7 days were almost ended, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, 'Men of Israel, help! This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people, meaning against the Jewish people, the law, meaning against the law, against the Torah, and this place, against this place, meaning against the temple. And furthermore, he also brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. And then in parentheses, verse 29, for they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, with him, with Paul in the city, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. Now, the first question is, who are these Jews from Asia? And I think that many, many commentaries, I mean, David Stern for sure says this in his commentary. He says these are normal, non-Messianic Jews from Asia. These are people hostile, to the whole movement. And it's these people that, because they were from Asia, meaning that they are from the lands that Paul had been operating in previously. And so these people get all upset seeing Paul. And we saw, obviously, when we go back to the previous chapters, we saw that, Paul did have opposition. Again, we saw that it was sort of murky because he was able to preach in the synagogues quite freely. But then there were always these issues that came up, like that people were jealous of Paul, or they were concerned that he was attracting people away from their synagogue. They don't have any substantive problems with Paul, what he's saying. They didn't seem to have any questions about what Paul was preaching, but they didn't like him for other reasons, for side reasons. So, but there was opposition to Paul. Now, it seems that there were objections to what Paul was teaching. And this comes out in the speech of these Jews from Asia. Now, I've seen commentaries which suggest that these were not non-Messianic Jews from Asia. These were Messianic Jews from Asia. These were people who were believers in Jesus, and they knew Paul, and they were bothered by Paul's theology and Paul's practice. So it's not 100% clear who this is speaking about. But here, let's just go through quickly the accusations. They say that Paul teaches against the people, meaning that he teaches things against the Jewish people. It's interesting that, when we get to the book of Galatians, we're going to have to analyze whether in Galatians Paul is only speaking to Gentiles from Galatia, right, that area, or is he speaking to all the people that are living there, Jews and non-Jews? It's not really 100% clear. And you can go through large parts of Galatians where it seems that Paul is speaking really not just to non-Jews. He's speaking on behalf of himself, who's clearly a Jew. And again, now is not the time to analyze it. When we get to Galatians, we'll have a lot of time to look deeply into what he says. But in the 5th chapter of Galatians, he gets apoplectic about circumcision and the fact that there are people that are preaching that believers in Jesus have to be circumcised. Now, again, it's not clear if he's only concerned about the fact that there were people advocating circumcision for Gentiles, or it was a question about whether anyone should be circumcised. But Paul says in the 5th chapter of Galatians, verse 12, that those people who are demanding circumcision, he said, I would just wish that the knife would slip and they would castrate themselves. That's what Paul says about his fellow Jews. But it gets worse. There are places in Paul's writings where he seems to imply that the real Jews are not Jews because they descend physically from Jewish parents, but real Jews are people who are Jewish because they have faith in the Messiah. So you do see within Paul, and it's not clear how far he goes with this, but the idea of replacement theology is something which, whether or not it's deeply rooted in the New Testament, there are at least things in the New Testament that gave license to Christians over the last 2,000 years to teach that the church has replaced Israel, and that really the definition of a Jew is not one who is a Jew because of biology, but because they have faith. They have the proper faith. So again, that might be another attack on the people people of Israel. And finally, in First Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 15, Paul has a famous, ugly accusation against the Jewish people, he says, who are hostile to all men. It's one of the ugliest things in the Christian Bible about Jews. So there are plenty of things that Paul did teach that could be seen as hostile to the people of Israel. And then when it says that he taught against the law, against the Torah, that is unquestionable, meaning that it's very clear that Paul teaches that salvation comes through faith in Jesus and not through observing the Torah. Right. Whether or not you're allowed to keep the Torah, whether you should keep the Torah, is not at this point what we're discussing. But what Paul says is that the essence of what it takes to be a child of God is not based upon what observance of the Torah that you do. It's based upon whether you have faith in Jesus. You see this, for example, in the book of Romans. You see it all over Romans. I mean, when we get to Romans, we'll find dozens of places where he says it, that you're no longer under the curse of the law.
Right.
But in chapter 3, verse 28, he says specifically that man is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. And in Galatians chapter 2, verse 16, he says that you're not justified by the Torah, but by faith in the Messiah Jesus.
What's interesting is, and actually in the same book, Romans, therefore we conclude that man is not justified by faith. But if you look at Romans chapter 2, verse 13, I think it is. I'm going to go here, 2:13, just to verify that. Romans 2:13. But see, here's another thing too. This is also, I just realized, a big, massive chunk right here is actually in parentheses, which is questionable. It says, "For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified." So the Messianic spin on that is he's not saying not to do it. He's just saying do it with the right motives. Because here Paul very clearly says, for not the hearers only of the law, but the ones that are actually doing it. But
right.
Again, it's in parentheses,
we're going to have a chance to get into these other books by Paul.
Right.
We don't have time to analyze them tonight,
okay.
But I think that what's clear to me, at least, is that there's certainly enough ammunition in the writings of Paul to show that he was someone who did not emphasize the importance of observing the Torah.
Yeah, agreed.
And to me, the proof is in the pudding. The proof is in the pudding. You don't see any of the followers coming out of Paul who are concerned about Torah observance. As a matter of fact, we know this historically, that the churches, the Christian movements that came out of Paul's teachings ended up persecuting the Jewish believers in Jesus who maintained a loyalty to observing the Torah, because they were opposed to any time Jews would observe, not talking about the normal Jewish community, Jews who believed in Jesus, they were opposed to their observing of the Torah because they believed that it cheapened grace.
Mm-hmm.
And
right.
So Messianics today could try to find, their arguments for saying that no, Paul was a totally Torah observant Jew. Obviously, you can make an argument for anything. To me, he has enough ammunition in his own words that, to me, very clearly don't speak highly about Torah observance.
Right.
And to me, the most important proof is in the pudding, that we see the result of Paul's teachings was not a movement of people who were loyal to Torah observance. On the contrary, they bitterly fought the Torah observance of fellow believers in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
But again, we'll have plenty of time to get into Acts and Galatians. So again, what he's accused of here is teaching. Again, we see, though, he's accused of this, meaning that these are accusations that are coming up here, not out of thin air, meaning why do these people from Asia accuse Paul of teaching against the Torah?
Well, looking back at Acts also, in Acts chapter 8, I think it was, or Acts chapter 6, I think it was, it says that they brought up false accusers against Stephen. accusing him also of teaching against the law of God. But it says they were false accusers. So these people, I mean, just by equal comparison, very well could have also been false accusers, just like they did with Stephen.
Well, again, all I'm saying is that we see in the writings of Paul himself,
In his own writings, right?
enough
right.
ammunition
True.
that would lead someone to believe that he wasn't pro-Torah.
Yeah, agreed.
It's quite clear. And so the fact that whether he was or wasn't, right? We're not going to find out tonight. But clearly there's enough reason that he was that people suspected him. And the point is that even James took those accusations as credible, meaning James didn't just say, I know Paul, he's a righteous dude, and he's like Torah observant. I would eat in his house. No, right. James seems to want to clarify this, and James seems to insist, no, Paul, you've got to go through this. You've got to clear your reputation. So I think that, whether or not Paul himself is Torah observant, we will have to wait to study all the material. I'm just saying that there are people who are suspicious of him, and I just wanted to throw out a few of the reasons tonight why people might be suspicious about Paul and his teachings against the Torah. And then if they say he teaches against this place, meaning that we have heard Paul basically saying that there are no more sacrifices because Jesus has replaced the sacrificial system, right. And that's why they're saying he's teaching against the temple. And that's, again, one of the reasons why they could have had Paul do anything to prove his loyalty to the Torah that didn't have to involve sacrifices. Mm-hmm. But they chose, no, we want Paul to put his reputation on the line by actually participating in the bringing of sin offerings. Now, whether or not he brought Greeks into the temple, I'm not going to be so concerned about that tonight. So let's wrap up because it's getting late.
Yes, sir.
So there's not much more to do at this point anyway. So what happens is everyone gets all upset. They're running around. They're going crazy. This is big news. This guy Paul, they wanted to kill him. Right in verse 30, the whole city was disturbed. They threw the whole city into a tumult, and the people ran and they seized Paul and they dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. And as they were seeking to kill him, I mean, this is serious stuff. Mm. So news came to the commander of the garrison that all of Jerusalem was in an uproar. Now, I just want to make two observations here. We see later on that, I'm not going to go through the whole passage here, but we see later on that when he reached the stairs, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. There was a huge mob chasing after Paul. For the multitude, this is in verse 36, the multitude of the people followed after, crying out, "Away with him." Now, there are many people who've suggested that Paul saw himself as the second Jesus. And the New Testament as well. There are many things when we study the life of Paul where he sees himself as sort of the second Jesus. And just as Jesus suffered from the Jews, Paul suffers from the Jews.
Right.
A lot of parallels. But I wanted to point out something more important. Here you see an entire city. It says the whole city is going crazy because of this accusation that Paul taught against the Jews and against the temple and against the Torah. Right? And they're about to kill him, and there's a big riot. But I think we have to notice something here, that it doesn't seem like there were riots every day because of the presence of James and Peter and John in the city.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You see from this that the Jewish followers of Jesus who were still in Jerusalem didn't provoke this kind of opposition, because again, from a Jewish point of view, they were Torah observant. They weren't doing anything to arouse anyone's hostility. They had a weird belief that Jesus was the Messiah, and even though he died, they believed he'll be back, right, soon to bring about the...
That is an amazing point, right? Just that right there alone could convict him. The fact that
a price of admission.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh my gosh, I've never even considered that thought at all. But that right there could send this whole thing home. My gosh, wow.
Okay. Anyway, we'll wrap it up now. There's sort of a weird interchange between Paul and the commander, right? But because Paul is led into the barracks, and he says to the commander, "May I speak to you?" Now, what language was Paul speaking at that point? Was Paul speaking to the commander in Hebrew? Why would he speak to the commander, this Roman commander, in Hebrew? So presumably Paul was speaking in Greek.
Right.
And he says, "May I speak to you?" And the commander says, "Can you speak Greek?" Now, why would he ask him if he can speak Greek if Paul was speaking in Greek? So it seems that what happened is that this commander, for some reason, thought that Paul was Egyptian, and that he was this Egyptian that had led a rebellion against Rome about 3 years earlier in the desert with about 4,000 assassins, we're told. And what happened is the Romans squashed this movement, but this Egyptian guy escaped. And so the commander here, for some reason, thinks that Paul is that Egyptian commander. And so he's not saying, "Can you speak Greek?" like asking him a question. He's sort of saying, "You can speak Greek?" That's what it really probably means, right? He was surprised because Paul is speaking to him in Greek, and he thought that Paul was this Egyptian, rebel, and so he's surprised, and he says, "Wow, you can speak Greek?" Anyway, Paul says, "Look, I'm a Jew from Tarsus, and he wants to be able to speak to the people," meaning he wants to speak to all the people, the Jewish people that are riled up against him. And so he's given permission, and next week, in chapter 22 of Acts, we'll begin to study the speech that Paul makes to this mob that wants to kill him in Jerusalem.
Wonderful. Don't take that wrong. Well, Rabbi, I've had fun. It's always good to see you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. We'll see all of y'all same time, same place next week for episode number 55 of Acts chapter 22. Rabbi, shalom to you, my dear friend, and I look forward to seeing you again. Shalom, everyone.
אני אתה אתם תמיד תמיד כולם ביחד חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד איפוק זו העוצמה ויתור זו הגדולה השאיפה והכמיהה